It's an honor and a pleasure to be here in front of you today. We've got a lot of material to move through, so that's why I'd asked for the questions to be held to the end. But I think given the audience here is somewhat technical, we all know what the DNS is and whatnot, I'm going to try to move more quickly through the front part of the presentation. But we're going to be talking about, as Gabriella indicated, some operational blind spots of many organizations with respect to DNS abuse, the reach of legal process, and then we're going to actually go into some real threat intelligence and show you some actual sophisticated attacks that I had been tracking from an APT group, or an advanced persistent threat group, that had been targeting critical infrastructure in the United States for some time. One thing about this presentation too, a long time ago, I made a very solemn obligation to myself and to all others is to never ever use clip art in any of my presentations. And so what we've done here for you today is actually create an art gallery for you with real art, since human beings have been creating things for thousands of years. No hackers and hoodies here. My background, by the way, is I'm the general counsel of the Ethereum name service, but I started out as a hacker a long time ago and then became a lawyer. As my mother used to say, that means I went from bad to worse, essentially. So with that, we're going to move our way through this art gallery and first talk a little bit with Amandrian about the domain name system itself. Like I said, I think we can step through this pretty quickly here. We all know it's a critical part of the internet, but the DNS has been subject to abuse for so long now. Remember going back to 1995 when the web was a new thing? This was the state of the art for Mercedes-Benz.com back in 1995. This was just straight up HTML being coded by hand. Web 1, it was all just reading data from a remote web server. And it was just amazing to see any company that had a particular website or a domain name that was actually live. And the V-Class was there back in 1995. This was cool to look at and to go back to the Internet Archive. But it didn't take long for the first UDRP filing to happen. If you don't know what the UDRP is, it's the Uniform Domain Name Resolution Policy. It's a little mini arbitration that occurs on the papers when there's bad faith in registration of a domain name, and a brand holder or a trademark holder or a name owner can use that process to reclaim their domain names. It's a policy that was created 26 years ago. And the first UDRP filing was by these pugilistic characters, the World Wrestling Federation, not the World Wildlife Federation here, but the WWF, not surprising, was apparently the first UDRP complainant. So moving on from there, DNS enforcement through the UDRP and other means has become this game of whack-a-mole, where lots of domains pop up. They're typo squatting domains, they're cyber squatting domains, they're opportunistic domains. And it's become this problem that is dual in nature. So it's an intellectual property issue that is really the domain of lawyers, and a counterfeiting issue, which is also the domain of lawyers. But it also has now, especially going back the last 10 or 12 years, security implications, cybersecurity implications in particular. So it is also the province of the CISO, or your security operations team, or your security operations center. So once you have this dual hybrid problem, that creates this dangerous blind spot, because the security people may be looking at this as a legal issue, and the legal issue may be looking at this as a security issue. And then that creates this dangerous rift of responsibility here in an organization, and especially large organizations where there's a lot of process involved in taking these things down. And so if we take a quick look at what's been happening in the meantime here, let's go back a few years ago when Symantec used to publish some of this data. Back in 2017, it was 1 in 13 URLs was actually malicious. It's gone up since then. And imagine, this is 5-6 years old, this data. I can only imagine that the prevalence of malicious URLs is even greater than 1 in 10 right now. So it's pretty extraordinary how malicious the internet is getting, and how many bad actors are out there. And this has led to, over the years, a lot of detectable and avoidable breaches. Deep Panda is an advanced persistent threat actor that is synonymous with Chinese intelligence and the Chinese government in many respects. And they're responsible for these particular breaches of WellPoint, CareFirst, Primera, and OPM. And these are the actual domains that were used in those attacks from Deep Panda. And if you look at wellpoint.com, the L's are not L's, they're ones, they're replaced with ones, and depending upon the font that you're using, they can be somewhat indistinguishable and confusingly similar visually. You have the same issue with CareFirst. Primera. And Primera was an interesting one too, because that was when you saw two N's put together and the kerning of the fonts to make it look like an M for Primera. And you can also get that together by putting an R and an N together. We see that a lot with targeting of Microsoft. And then there was OPM security. For many of you here probably know what OPM is, but some of you don't. It is, I think, probably one of the largest HR departments on the planet. It's the Office of Personnel Management. And the Office of Personnel Management is essentially the gigantic HR department for the federal government. And what Deep Panda had targeted through this domain, OPM security, was basically the SF-86 information of all federal employees. And the SF-86 is for anybody who's ever held a security clearance, the National Security Questionnaire. That's about 70-something pages long, and it's incredibly invasive in terms of the questions that they ask you, because they're determining your suitability for holding a security clearance with the federal government. And that can range from a secret clearance up to a TSSCI clearance. And a long time ago, I used to work in defense and intelligence. I used to work at CIA a long time ago. And I had TSSCI, top secret clearance, with access to sensitive compartmented information. And then I also had a separate clearance from the Department of Defense. And when this breach happened, I wound up getting 2 data breach notification letters from the Office of Personnel Management notifying me that my data had been stolen. And that's a very scary thing to think about, all of that data of everybody that's held the security clearance being in the hands of a hostile foreign power to the United States. And it all started with a domain name. But what we have to think about with respect to the DNS and the DNS abuse is that it's like a garden, right? And if you let your garden just go unattended, there's going to be weeds that are going to grow. So let's take a look at what happened with Trump.com. And Trump.com was really interesting, because if you take a look at some of this regular kind of straight up DNS data, almost every single permutation, every type of bit squatting around Trump.com has been taken up. And a lot of these domains and servers and hosts are way outside the United States, and nobody was really paying attention to that whatsoever. However, there was a very big difference between the Trump organization, the commercial enterprise, and the Trump campaign. And as I talked about at a Hackers on Planet Earth conference in 2018, the Trump campaign, we could spend an hour talking just about this incident, but there was targeting that was going to impersonate and make a false statement about the then candidate Donald Trump. And they were watching the DNS, and they were able to find this domain, find the character behind it, and neutralize it. And that presentation is on YouTube if anybody wants to check it out. It's actually quite an interesting story that I told about unraveling that campaign in 2018 at the Hope Conference in New York. But what we're talking about here is the regular DNS, right? The second level domain registrations. These are actually the surface level blind spots. They're easily exploitable, but they're also easily findable because these domains exist in zone files somewhere. So what I want to talk about next is essentially what is below the surface level that is way more dangerous, and is now we're getting into the province of more sophisticated threat actors when it comes to DNS abuse, when it comes to phishing. And oftentimes it's below the surface, and especially with the DNS, it's below the surface that has the most dangerous type of activities. And this is the DNS space of subdomains that we're going to be talking about. It's unregulated, it's difficult to detect, and very difficult to take down. Now let's take a look at some real threat intelligence from a couple of years ago with a generic-looking domain name, gov-survey.org here. So gov-survey.org, even if you've got some kind of brand protection system in place and you're monitoring the DNS for targeting of your organization, when the registration of gov-survey.org occurs, nobody is going to pick that up. These are totally generic terms. Nobody's watching the DNS for all these gov domains or survey domains. It's just not on anybody's radar, right? And survey is really not even a term that you could reasonably trademark in and of itself, right? So gov-survey.org isn't going to set off any alarms or bells or whistles or anything like that. However, what we see here are the creation of subdomains at the host level on top of gov-survey.org, right? And when you start a domain with gov, and especially gov-, when you create a subdomain to the left of that, what you are creating is basically an exact replica of the URL structure of the official gov domain of the United States government. And what we have here is a bunch of these subdomains created by a threat actor, and we're going to talk about this threat actor a little further into the presentation in the last half of it here. But you have, take a look at this one, floridavotes.gov-survey.org. That was a real bogus Florida voting impersonation domain that occurred during the midterm elections and was used during the midterm elections starting in June of 2018. Let's take a look at the last couple of these as well. ICE, we all know about ICE, constantly in the news here. ICE is one of the domains that was impersonated by this particular threat actor. We also have the impersonation of the U.S. Treasury and a news site of the U.S. Treasury being impersonated, news.treasury.gov. Now, if these are the structures of domains being used, where you have a generic domain that is registered with subdomains to the left of that second level domain, and you're looking at this, let's say, on a mobile device, the rest of the domain, the trailing bit of the domain, that -survey.org, etc., is quite likely going to be truncated in your browser. You're not going to see that at all. You're going to see, however, what looks like the official URL of Immigration and Customs Enforcement or of news.treasury.gov, because everything that we've been told in terms of maintaining good cyber hygiene, etc., is to always look at the URL structure. Make sure you're on the official.com site. Make sure you're on the official.gov site before you hand over your information or you believe the information that's being presented to you. And here, by the use of subdomains, they've turned that advice that we've been taking and using on its head by replicating what looks to be like the legitimate structure of an actual .gov domain. And of course, this works with .com, .net, .org, etc. And these can be created by anybody at any time. You don't have to register them. They're all created at the host level through DNSA records or the like. And more importantly, unlike the UDRP, where you're talking about a registered domain name, something that's in a zone file somewhere that you use a registrar to create, there's no legal authority through the UDRP system to actually remove a subdomain itself. And in fact, the policy of the UDRP explicitly does not reach those subdomains. And I think the reason being is because the hosts are not contracted parties with ICANN. And by the way, hello from the Contracted Party Summit in Manchester to everybody, which is where I am at the moment. So let's dig a little deeper into this, right? So sophisticated criminals are using these types of subdomains for lots of malicious activities, right? And for good reasons, right? It's going to evade brand detection. If you're monitoring for registrations in the DNS, looking for your name, looking for your brand, looking for permutations of your brand, looking for internationalized domains containing your brand with non-Latin characters or Punycode characters, you're not going to pick that up at all unless you're looking for individual host names as well. And this has been used for credentials harvesting. We're going to see examples of that in a little while. OWA duplication, Outlook web access duplication for your Outlook portal, single sign-on duplication, misinformation, lots of financial redirection as well for threat actors, getting into email addresses, going down to the bottom of your inbox, and then redirecting direct deposit information is another thing that we've seen this type of activity being used for. So these external threats, really, they can't be addressed alone. They're not legal in and of themselves, and they're not technical, right? So you really need to have some kind of hybrid mechanism in an organization to make sure that these are not missed. So sharing and collaborating is critical within an organization and also without the organization. And we're going to talk about that a little further as well. Creating some kind of process, playbook, and practice, incident response plans is also incredibly important to taking down these types of domains effectively. And what do we have at our disposals for these particular subdomains? We're really at the mercy of the hosts. We have to send takedown letters and takedown notices and requests over to the hosts themselves. A lot of times these hosts are going to be hiding behind services like Cloudflare as well. So you may have to go to Cloudflare first, who can then relay a message to a host. And all this takes time. And what the threat actors are looking for is uptime. And unfortunately, right now, that's what they have. And that's what they get. But if we're going to be safe here, we have to be fast. So safety requires swift action here, and ad hoc responses are just not going to cut it anymore. So I want to move in from some of the practical and theoretical aspects of this and jump into the second bit of the presentation here, where we're going to talk about how this applies in the context of intelligence and counterfeiting. And we're going to talk specifically about some pharma examples here. So let's take a look at Levitra. Levitra, some people may know, many may not, is an erectile dysfunction medication. It's not nearly as popular as Cialis or Viagra, your little purple pills, but it is still incredibly popular erectile dysfunction medication, apparently, and highly counterfeited. And you see a lot of activity targeting Levitra and creating marketplaces in the DNS. And let's take a look at the subdomain space here. This is just a very small sampling subdomain data that we have extracted from the DNS. And Levitra, a little more background here. Sex is apparently pretty expensive these days. It was around $73 for a tablet. Counterfeits, as we also probably should know by now, don't just benefit the counterfeiters themselves. They are often associated with operations that fund organized crime. And in fact, some of them have even been found to have organized terrorism as well, gone over to terrorist groups. And of course, if you're buying counterfeit medication from someplace like Southeast Asia and you're not entirely sure what is in these, or even if they are counterfeit, it might look like a legitimate site from which you're buying medication, but there are massive, significant health risks with ingesting these types of counterfeit medications. And always the safety of the consumer, the safety of the person is what's paramount here. So let's just dive into some of this data because I find it interesting. I hope you guys do too. Every single one of these, there's some duplicates here, but every single one of these is a counterfeit subdomain, counterfeit marketplace through a subdomain that's hiding out in the DNS. And there's so many of these, right? It's extraordinary what you see here. And it just keeps going. And like I said, this is a very small sampling of this data from the DNS. But let's dig into one of these. I just picked one of these and we can pull the thread on this, peel back the onion, whatever particular analogy you want to use here. So let's check out levitragenerique.thaimain.com. So investigating thaimain.com. Here we go. So thaimain.com. So what is this? I'm also a professor of law at King's College, and I also teach this lecture often to my students. I give this lecture often to my students as well, that are mostly postgraduate lawyers. And I always ask them, what do you think thaimain.com is? Yeah, and a lot of people will guess that it has to do with some kind of restaurant, a Thai main dish or something like that. You expect to see something like Penang curry on the menu here. That's what I thought as well. However, it was interesting to note that thaimain.com, which was hosting, recall, the levitragenerique.thaimain.com subdomain, was actually the government public relations department of the Office of the Prime Minister of Thailand. And this was an old domain that nobody had been maintaining. Obviously, it's another one of these very old domains that hasn't been updated in quite a while, looks very Web 1-like, but it was an official Thai government domain, apparently. And nobody had been caring or tending to the registrar account. So somebody likely compromised the registrar account and then started abusing that particular domain through the hosting of subdomains. And why would they do this? Why would they host on thaimain.com? Because of the scoring systems that email gateway appliances and other security appliances within an organization score. So the longevity of a domain can indicate a certain level of trust and verifiability of a domain. If a domain is registered yesterday and you get an email that comes into your gateway, your email security appliance, whether you're using Mimecast or Proofpoint, etc., they're going to take a look at the age of the domain. And if the domain has existed since 1999 continuously, it's pretty likely that it's going to be some kind of official domain name, right? There's that assumption that's made here. And I think it's most of the time a reasonable assumption. If a domain, again, has been registered within the last couple of days or weeks or months, it's more likely that could be a phishing domain that's created just to harvest your credentials or phish your employees, etc. So what the bad guys have done, not surprisingly, is find these domains that are housed in insecure registrar accounts and compromise them by piling up subdomains on top of them, because the email security appliances aren't looking necessarily at the longevity of the subdomains. They're looking at the longevity of the domain name itself. And it's harder to tell how old the subdomain itself is, right? Because you would have to take a look at maybe like passive DNS data or take a look at the certificate transparency logs, not just necessarily do a whois lookup on the domain, or these days an RDAP lookup on a domain. So this domain was hacked and abused. And let's take a look now at what it was actually hosting at levitragenerique.thaimain.com. And not surprisingly, it was a counterfeit marketplace in the French language that was selling counterfeit Levitra, the erectile dysfunction medication, but it was also selling Viagra, Cialis, and Camagra. Camagra apparently is also another erectile dysfunction jelly or something like that. I didn't even know that existed. There were also a couple of other subdomains that were interesting to take a look at here. There was also cheap calls to Turkey .tiemain.com, and you can see it's the same kind of layout as Le Vitre Générique, but selling calling cards to Turkey. I don't know if they were legit calling cards or if they were just stealing money or not. And then there was this other kind of strange subdomain that didn't make a lot of sense here. There was 5diamondcats.tiemain.com. And to my mind, I think this just proves everlastingly that if you go far enough on the internet and down certain rabbit holes, what you're always just going to run into is cats. I cannot necessarily explain why there was the replication of an actual Pennsylvania breeder site on top of tiemain.com. I think maybe it was used to distribute malware, possibly in some kind of forum post or something like that. But this was a real breeder in Pennsylvania. And I sincerely hope that all these kittens were adopted by Christmas that year too, but can't really explain necessarily why 5diamondcats was on tiemain.com. The internet has strange things. But thinking about this, right, it's not enough to just create a counterfeit marketplace in the subdomain space and have it hiding out there. You have to push traffic somehow to get over to your counterfeit marketplace, right? You need this diversion of legitimate traffic that's related to the counterfeit itself. And you have to avoid targeting traffic of the counterfeit to be sold because that's noisy, right? You don't want your host names and subdomains and things like that to necessarily have, with respect to your traffic, to have the targeted brand in them as well. You have to figure this out and you have to be discreet. But you have to make sure that you have traffic that gets over to your site that also would have an interest in the product. So it's a marketing problem, right? And an internet traffic diversion problem. So with respect to counterfeit erectile dysfunction medication, this is another time where I often open it up to my students to guess at what type of sites would be diverted over to these counterfeit marketplaces. And if you're thinking at the moment that it would be pornography, you'd be absolutely right. For those of you with prurient things on your mind, you're absolutely correct. And I think the assumption being made by the threat actors here is that these are actual legitimate porn sites. They host real porn. They're targeting perhaps other types of porn sites, maybe by Google ad poisoning or buying sponsored advertisements in various places. You go to these sites, they will distribute real pornography to you. But I think what the owners of Le Vitre Générique tiemain.com are hoping is that perhaps there's some kind of equipment malfunction or failure. An ad for erectile dysfunction medication appears on the side, and that's what's diverting the traffic over to those marketplaces hiding in the subdomain space. Fascinating when you look at this and you pull the thread. And by understanding the MO, the modus operandi of these counterfeiters and threat actors, we can do a lot of stuff here, right? We can identify the reach and scope of their activities. We can collect critical evidence about the timing of the creation of these subdomains, the names that they're being used. You can, if you figure out the patterns that they're using, you can also begin to track their activities in real time in the DNS by using passive DNS, by looking at domain registrations and in particular also the bulletproof hosts and the hosting systems that are used to launch these particular types of attacks. And maybe if you're lucky, even achieve some kind of attribution or get close to it, because everybody makes mistakes. The bad guys are always making mistakes. But critically as well, and this is really important for any organization, whether it's ICANN or whether it's LVMH or a 20-person company, you have to conserve resources. Nobody has unlimited resources to prioritize every single domain name or every single subdomain that pops up that might be targeting their products or their company. It's just a matter of going after not just the low-hanging fruit, but the worst of the worst, the most sophisticated threat actors and those that are part of larger networks. And so that prioritization of enforcement, I think, can be really important because it protects the safety of the consumer ultimately. And that's what this is all about. This is all about safety here. From a phishing and counterfeiting and brand protection perspective, though, being able to look at this data and know what to do with it, know that it exists, and know how to take it down, it adds another element to these types of activities. And to my mind, and I've always been preaching this, even with competitors, I think it's so important to share this type of intelligence. So let's take a look at some of the statistics here. Tons of domains targeting Cialis, Viagra, Xanax, and this is the number that's continuously changing. Subdomains, not nearly as many as the domains, but quite a few. And you'll see that some of the statistics can be surprising, and it's actually very difficult to get any real live data on this particular type of targeting as well. But let's take a look at some screenshots from the DNS and see what we are seeing out there in terms of other counterfeit pharmaceuticals and marketplaces hiding out there. And some of this is really scary to my mind. We see just about every type of medication having counterfeit marketplaces in the subdomain space in the DNS just hiding out there. And the ones that are really scary to me are the ones that involve fentanyl. There are just too many deaths in the United States from fentanyl, and too many young people, of course, being affected by that epidemic as well. Let's take a look at another one about why it's so important to share this type of information amongst industry as well. Here's a domain that was registered in .ru, right? CNVIP, so maybe ChinaVIP.ru, perhaps, right? And if you take a look at this, they all relate to a single industry. What industry is that? It's the luxury industry, right? So on top of CNVIP.ru, you've got Celine, Hermes, Michael Kors, Montblanc, Polo, and they're all separate marketplaces selling counterfeit goods in a .ru domain. And those are owned by different companies as well. I used to be the chief compliance officer of Richemont, which owns Montblanc, as well as Cartier, Piaget, IWC, a whole bunch of the watch brands that you'll see in the cover of the Financial Times weekend edition that are out of price range for most normal human beings. But see, if you find this, it would be important, I think, to share the information with Michael Kors, to share the information with Celine. And if Celine found it, I would think that and hope that they would share this information with Montblanc as well, so that we can all prioritize enforcement against this domain together. Or maybe one party can take it out and the other party sits back and uses its resources to target another domain, because this is happening continuously. And so this data it's important to protect the consumer in this way and to understand that it's used to hide these types of counterfeit marketplaces and whatnot. But it can also be extremely critical to avoiding major cybersecurity disasters as well. And this is where we're going to jump into the next aspect of this presentation and talk about some real threat intelligence data that I had been mining for some time. And I'll tell you the story about how we found this. This is an active threat, and this threat actor is actually still, to this day, active. And I do believe I made some kind of attribution and crossover with the nature of the threat actor as well, and where they are and how they came to be. So we'll get into that. But let's tell the story of how we wound up finding them and wound up tracking them. So I'd been doing some DNS monitoring I built a separate DNS monitoring platform many years ago, about 7 or 8 years ago, and we used this to monitor different healthcare clients and sports industry clients to help them out with the space. We were monitoring for a healthcare client, and this particular healthcare client had just undergone a merger as well and became one of the largest healthcare institutions, top 10 largest healthcare institutions in the United States. And we found a single subdomain with the name of this particular institution in it. And it did not necessarily make sense being on top of a separate domain that related to a bridge club in Florida. So I'm wondering, why is this healthcare institution has all these hospitals around the country in the Midwest popping up on top of this strange domain name? Just like timemain.com, it was a hacked domain. And why was it a hacked domain? Because it had a lot of longevity. And because of that longevity, it had a lot of trust. And what we saw on top of that domain was not only was our healthcare institution being targeted, that particular client, with the phishing campaign. And the phishing campaign was very sophisticated looking, really believable. I'm going to show you some examples of specifically what this looked like. But I had to get the CISO on the phone in the evening to confirm whether or not this was a legit thing that the company was doing. And he wasn't sure himself. He had to call up the HR department because it involved the impersonation of the HR department. But what we saw as well was really quite concerning, in that when I took a look at the subdomains that also existed, in addition to this healthcare client being targeted, we saw a whole bunch of other infrastructure targets that were associated with the United States. So we saw a couple of different power companies in the South being hit by the same credentials harvesting attack impersonating HR. We saw the Tennessee Valley Authority being targeted as well. And it was really quite fascinating to see all this clustering of targets together with our healthcare client all being targeted by the same actor through use of subdomains on top of a hacked domain, and a very believable, very professional looking credentials harvesting attack on top of it. So my assumption was, and my curiosity got the best of me and my hacker background kicked in and said, I know what types of breadcrumbs they're going to leave behind here. There's going to be some information in certificate transparency logs and hosts and the DNS, and they're guaranteed that this is such a sophisticated attack. They have probably done this before. So I started looking for older attacks, and it took me a while to latch on to the TTPs, or the tactics, techniques, and procedures of this particular advanced persistent threat, or APT group. But I did, and I was able then to find a whole bunch of historical attacks. It took quite literally churning through billions and billions of records to find them. And then once I understood how they launched their attacks and how they use these generic sounding newly registered domains sometimes to then host new attacks on companies, I was able to track them in real time and understand whom they were going to target before they even got their attacks live. And we were able to notify a lot of the would-be victims before they got hit and tell them how to deflect and neutralize these particular types of attacks. And it was very effective. But the threat actors would pivot and they'd hit them again and again. But it was an interesting cat and mouse game to play with these guys because they were really quite good, and they still are. Become a little bit more difficult to track too. But in unraveling this particular type of threat, what we found was that this threat actor had been targeting around 1,700 entities. And most of the entities, the vast majority of the entities, were in the United States, but there were other entities in the United Kingdom, in Canada, and Australia as well. But the vast majority were in the United States and targeting certain important sectors of the U.S. economy, including the energy sector. And this is a somewhat geographically accurate representation as to where the targets were clustered as well. So you see a lot of the energy sector being targeted in the South, as well as the Midwest. And in Colorado in particular, what we saw were oil pipelines being targeted by these guys. A couple of different infrastructure players there. It was quite interesting. Pharmaceutical companies themselves were being targeted pretty heavily. By far, the largest cluster of targets that we saw were on healthcare institutions in the United States. And that was about 400 something. I think it was around 470 healthcare institutions or hospitals around the country being targeted by this particular threat actor. And then we saw universities, lots of universities, including some that are not on the map because they're outside the continental United States, but the University of Hawaii was one of them. We were able to help them out as well. But a lot of these universities, what they seemed to have in common were advanced physics or research institutes. Very oftentimes they had ties with the Department of Defense or some kind of contract with the Department of Defense. So we think maybe the idea there was to use these universities as an entryway into larger, more high-value targets as well. Because we also saw the defense sector being heavily targeted by these particular threat actors as well. And the DIB in particular, or the defense industrial base, lots of government contractors that work in the defense space being targeted. And we'll show you some of that. Heavy industry. Heavy industry's got lots of trade secrets and probably valuable information for a threat actor to exfiltrate. And then we saw government targets. And government targets, I'm talking about from the federal agency level down, from like literally top federal agencies of the U.S. government here, known household names, all the way down to local school districts. And that was a very strange thing to see. A lot of local school districts were being targeted by this highly sophisticated threat actor utilizing subdomains in a very malicious way. And if you think that many school districts find it difficult to even provide student lunches to their students, cybersecurity is an afterthought for them. So to my mind, these types of attacks were probably like a hot knife going through warm butter when it came to the targeting of those local school districts around the country. Don't know exactly why, but a lot of this was often before an election cycle. And we think maybe it could have been used for compromising polling places, or the ability to show that a polling place might have been compromised if the need actually arose. And then, really weirdly and very eerily, the food distribution network of the United States was very heavily targeted by this threat actor. We're talking about everything from cooling systems to trucking for food systems to restaurant distribution. It was a weird clustering, but a very definitive clustering of targets in the food distribution ecosystem in the U.S. and not any other country, just the United States. But then we saw some outlier targets as well. And some of these outlier targets were Also, another indication that we're dealing with a sophisticated threat actor. We saw one that was very likely a Lebanese attorney that worked in the tech sector. It was a fairly common Middle Eastern name, so my attribution is not 100% on that. But then we also saw a very high-profile Qatari ambassador being targeted by this threat actor group as well. It was actually Yusuf al-Qatar, who was a high-profile Qatari ambassador to the United Kingdom as well. So in thinking about this, some of my attribution conclusion was this is probably some kind of access broker working on behalf of several APTs or advanced persistent threat groups, or some kind of separate state-sponsored actor that might be this prolific. And if you look at some of the unsealed indictments that come out of the Department of Justice, a lot of this clustering and categorization of attacks matches the interests of Chinese APTs as well as Iranian APT threat actor groups. But I think we were wrong about that, because in working with a certain reporter over at Reuters, Raphael Satter, who had shared a lot of this data with him, it turns out that he was also working on another story about an organization called Appin Technology Centers, which was started out in India as a training center for IT workers in India, and then became a hacker for hire operation. And it seems a lot of this data crosses over with some of their targeting as well. And I think what I had latched onto was a branch of this targeting of an Indian, a very prolific, very sophisticated Indian hacker for hire operation that had been working for many years and was a strand and thread that nobody had really seen before. And so they were probably working for nation states. They were probably working for law firms. They were probably working for private investigators that would be working for law firms. And it was a very interesting story that came out and wound up being a protracted legal battle because an injunction was issued against Reuters and against Raphael, and Reuters had to take down the reporting about this. It was the first time a reporting had been of this nature had received an injunction. And then a law firm in the United States was telling places like the New Yorker and podcasts and Muckrock not to report on this particular type of issue as well. So you saw this type of lawfare actually affecting actionable threat intelligence about a live threat actor that had been out and targeting well over 1,700 organizations in the United States. So it was a fascinating story, and that injunction was appealed, and Reuters won the appeal, and the story is back up. So I'm happy to share a link to that story, but I think it's an important one, and I think that these targets relate specifically to that threat actor. That's my theory here. It's not 100%, but I think it's a very plausible theory of attribution. We all know attribution here is hard. This threat actor, though, in terms of attribution, we found 750 domains of this particular APT that we think was associated with the Indian hacker for hire operation. We saw so many major companies targeted. And how did they do it? They impersonated the HR functions. Initially, they were also using some Malaysian cutouts that we know for sure because we had found some usernames and it connected to old technical forums that were reused. And we found these types of things in older DNS records and older WHOIS records as well. So that can be a very often fertile source of actionable threat intelligence against these groups because everybody makes mistakes, especially when you're establishing your proof of concept targeting, like I think we found here. And we saw lots of these regions and supply chains targeted as well. So this clustering would happen. Let's say you're targeting some kind of infrastructure target, and we're going to show you what this data looks like now. But you see a clustering of targets around what we believe to be the center target as well. So they would be targeting law firms. They'd be targeting entities that are associated with the high value target that they want to compromise, that would have the high grade ore that they're trying to exfiltrate in most opinions. Targeting accountancies, targeting law firms, targeting partners, all within a certain geographic area. And then you would see the high grade ore. So let's take a look at what I believe was one of the targetings of the high grade ore for this threat actor group. This was an actual live credentials harvesting attack that they had utilized. And they were targeting this company called Tetra. It was Tetra Tech. And if you take a look at the domain name, it might be a little bit difficult to see given the resolution here, but the domain name was esurveynet.com. Again, another domain that nobody's going to be watching for in terms of anything, of sounding any alarms when it's registered in the DNS, esurveynet.com. And then on top of that, you have the target's name in the form of a subdomain, Tetra Tech Inc. You take a look at this, they've got the company logo here. they've set this up to make it look like you're possibly on your intranet when you click on this particular link. And what it is, it's a bogus HR employee satisfaction survey. It's just the sort of annoying thing that an HR representative, no offense, not too much offense to HR people, okay, but it comes with the territory. But it is really the kind of annoying thing that everybody expects to come from HR. You have to do this survey within 48 hours or by the end of the week. And it's a legitimate survey. If you take a look at the questions, my pay matches my job performance. They maintain a competitive pay and benefits package. Do you agree, strongly disagree? Now imagine your company had just gone through a merger and you received one of these. You're afraid of being made redundant because the functions are going to be merging. You want to make sure you get this thing done. You're under time pressure. So what they would do is you start filling this out. And when you get about halfway through it, you realize, oh, this isn't going to take me very long, but you're invested in it. And then this pop-up would appear asking for your username and password. You've already invested some time. You're almost done with the survey. And now you have to authenticate yourself. So it looks like you're on your intranet. So you put in your username and password, and then you're back to the survey. Nothing else happens except your username and password have been processed now by a server-side PHP script sent over to a Telegram channel of the threat actors. They now have your credentials, and literally within minutes, they're going to be inside your inbox or trying to access your company through some of their external VPNs on which they've already done some recon. Right? These guys, they have got copyright notices and everything looks legit. And it looks like the kind of, exactly like I said, the type of wonky HR survey that would be expected of you at any time and sprung at you at any moment. So let's take a look for a second, though, at who was this targeted company, Tetra, right? They're a Houston area water management company. This occurred a few years ago in 2019. And I didn't know what they were. I didn't know what this was, but is a completion fluids and water management company for, how do they refer to this? I think it was called, shale completion, of course. I didn't know what the heck shale completion was. And it's a fancy word for fracking. So fracking. And fracking apparently requires a lot of water because you drill into the earth and you need to put something really heavy in that giant hole that you've drilled in the earth so that you crack the core of the earth or its mantle. I'm not an earth scientist, but you crack whatever it is that's underneath there, and then that releases the natural gases that have been stuck there for however many years, right? And water is what you would ordinarily put down there. So lots and lots of water. Water is really heavy. You can't send down, I don't know, bulldozers or something like that, right? The hole's not big enough. In any event, so Tetra was targeted, and water is really important to them, right? And so, interestingly enough, 12 days earlier, we saw the targeting same exact attack, bogus employee satisfaction survey impersonating the HR function, however, of the Association of Water Board Directors in the Houston area. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. That's really weird. So then we take a look at the map there. Like, all right, are they really close to each other? Yeah, they are. The Association of Water Board Directors, that kind of governs the use of water in that area, is just down the street, like literally a few minutes away from Tetra Technologies. So here's a perfect example of that clustering of the infrastructure targets around a target as well, right? If they got into the Association of Water Board Directors, they could then use that as a springboard to send malware, to get their emails over to Tetra Tech, which was what I believe was the high-value target in this particular attempt. I have no idea whether or not it was successful or not. But let's take a look at some of the other attacks here. I mentioned this is targeting lots of industries around the United States. Here's an example of a targeting, same exact bogus employee satisfaction survey, targeting a dairy company, targeting SSAI, Science Systems and Applications Incorporated, right? They are the government contractor for NASA. They do the IT systems for the Jet Propulsion Laboratory for NASA. Kind of scary when you think about that. So you have deep space being targeted. Here's a defense contractor in the defense industrial base being targeted. And then you also have even DHS itself and TSA. And coincidentally, I found this attack on a TSA right after I got off of a plane and through a TSA checkpoint. I didn't know if they were playing a joke on me or something, but in any event, that was one that was particularly serious, of course. And many other targets beyond there, right? And then what happens when your credentials are harvested, your email inbox is accessed, your VPN is accessed, and now the threat actor is exfiltrating data from your inbox or exfiltrating data from your company, from your network shares, etc., right? I could spend an entire course or module talking about this legal roadmap of what happens. I don't want to bore you all with this because I call it this for a reason. I call it the legal roadmap to hell, because this is what kicks off when one of these incidents is successful, right? You get your credentials harvested, your systems are accessed. You have to pull in. I'm going to go through this really quickly here. Incident response, containment, remediation. And some of this happens in parallel as well. Looks like it's serial, but a lot of this should really be in parallel, right? So the legal department is notified and involved in all of this. You have to determine whether or not these threat actors have any kind of persistent hold in your organization. You're going to then be hiring consultants, forensic consultants, to figure out if you can fully evict these threat actors. Then you've got privacy issues, you've got data classification problems, you've got state statutes, you've got federal law, CCPA in California, Department of Financial Services in New York, attorneys generals, you've got GDPR and ICOs in Europe. It's a total mess. Then you've got contracts, right? Contracts all now have contractual notification provisions. If there's some kind of incident that involves cybersecurity, you might have to notify people contractually over that. Your general counsel's involved. He gets your CEO, COO involved. The board has to probably be notified. Eventually, the shareholders are going to be notified of this. Your insurance carrier is in the loop in all of this as well, probably going to be working with your general counsel. You could have coverage. You may or may not have coverage. That's why there's a question there, right? Very often there's been exceptions to coverage in the event that a cybersecurity incident relates to a known threat actor that is an APT associated with a nation state. And so those, let's say it's Russia targeting you or it's North Korea targeting you, you may be in a situation where you have insurance but no coverage for that particular incident because of the carve-outs for acts of war coming from a nation state. And these might be considered to be acts of war. Those have gone up on appeal, believe it or not, in New Jersey, of all places. And so the law is a little bit different on there, but still it's something that insurance agencies are trying to disclaim coverage for. And then you've got your outside counsel working with your consultants, your insurance carrier is going to be your conduit to protect privilege, et cetera. All of this gets extremely expensive for any organization. So important to be mindful of this and to avoid having this sideshow, this circus, this very expensive circus happening all the time. So in trying to wrap this up, as we're getting closer to the hour here, to the top of the hour, that is, I think minding and mining the DNS is so important, right? This is a really actionable intelligence to understand how phishing attacks work, the evolution and life cycle of these phishing attacks and how they use the subdomain space, not necessarily just domains, but this is important stuff for IP and brand protection, for counterfeiting, for cybersecurity. And if you look at this properly, you can have a lot more actionable and complementary and highly prioritized investigations and enforcement activities that don't necessarily break the bank. If you can see the forest for the trees, if you can see the network of threat actors and you understand which ones are more sophisticated, which ones are the real threats here, if you can see the mosaic that's being painted by the threat intelligence data, that's how you can begin to determine how to prioritize that enforcement, conserve resources and money. And you're not only, I think, enhancing your client organization's posture, but also your industry cybersecurity posture as well when you handle it like that. We've covered a lot of ground in just under 53 minutes here, so I very much appreciate everybody tuning in, listening. Again, my name's Alex Urbelis. I'm General Counsel of the Ethereum Name Service, Professor of Law, King's College London. And you can connect with me over on LinkedIn. Happy to take any questions now. I know it was a lot of information. So back to you, Gabriella and Ulrich.
Thank you so much, Alexander. This was indeed a lot, but all of it was really interesting. So we have already questions coming in, but I encourage everyone to come with more questions to take advantage of having you with us today. The first question comes from Maciek Piasecki, and he's asking, my clients often ask me, what is the risk if they only clicked on the link without any further action? I usually tell them to make sure their device was up to date, maybe changing the passwords to make sure MFA is on, and to be cautious because they might be flagged as an active user. What would you say?
I would say I think that's good advice. Generally, if you haven't inserted your credentials, you're probably okay. I think a really good idea to rotate credentials anyway, scan the system for malware. There are more sophisticated attacks, and I think it's important then to also look at the level of sophistication of the attack. Were they targeting just this employee? Is it a spear phishing attack targeting multiple employees in the organization, or was it some kind of whaling attack going after your CFO, going after your CEO? Those types of just clicking on a link might activate some malicious JavaScript on the back end that could do something bad. You also want to scan the system to make sure that it didn't drop some malware as like a drive-by download Oftentimes it could be like a malicious Zoom package or something. It's dropped into a download directory. So to be really safe, you might want to wipe the device, make sure MFA is turned on, and rotate credentials. That would be my suggestion. One thing also I should note too, so I'm general counsel and CISO at the Ethereum name service. I was also the CISO at the NFL for some time as well. So I've kind of been sitting on both sides of the fence here. So back to you, Gabriella. But great question.
Thank you so much. The next two questions are really to me. It's asking about the recording, and I have posted the link where the recording will be up within an hour after the end of this webinar. So please go there and you will have it there. So I'll reply to those two. I see there's a question in the chat room. Are there any other platforms or tools that could help to investigate investigate particular DNS or subdomains? This is in the chat room. I just want to encourage everyone to type the questions in the Q&A pod, please.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of public data that you can look at as well. So I think a really important one is the use of certificate transparency logs, because these attacks don't exist without having some kind of SSL certificate associated with them. All right. So looking at the certificate transparency logs can show you for which subdomains an SSL cert has been issued. That's really actionable threat intelligence. That's really important. You can use passive DNS tools to do that. I'm also happy to talk offline about the types of DNS monitoring and things that we might be able to help people with. That's not the point of this at all, but I think a lot of public sources are important to look at. A little bit trickier these days too is a lot of the threat actors will use throwaway SSL certs that came from Let's Encrypt. But Let's Encrypt also now allows wildcard SSL certificates. They're issuing those for some time now, which makes it more difficult to track the specific subdomains that are being used if a wildcard SSL cert covers anything that's going to resolve on a particular domain. It's tricky, it's hard, but the data's out there. You just have to know under which stones to look and what things to turn around.
Again, we have a question in the chat room, and again, I'd like to underline, please do not use the chat room, use the Q&A pod. But I can read this out. It comes from Yao. Maybe he's asking, what tools do you often use to investigate the DNS and subdomain abuses, and what best practices are there?
Yeah, so I use a tool that I built myself, actually. And it's something I started actually to help some of my former law partners understand how to acquire DNS data without necessarily being adept in using a Linux terminal. My misspent youth is what kind of propelled me forward here in this respect. So I started scripting some things out and then realizing, oh, if I pull down this zone data, I can take a look at this and look for deltas. And then I wound up creating tens of thousands of lines of code that look for mounted attacks in the DNS targeting individual companies, and also looking for mounted attacks on what would otherwise be generic domains, right? So things that involve survey, things that involve HR, right? Looking at these domains and knowing what to flag and block at that level of registration can also really help shore up an organization's cybersecurity posture, because you're not going to be subject to a lot of these spray and pray attacks as well. So I use a lot of things that I built myself. Also happy to share code and happy to talk with others about sharing intelligence and data. We share a lot of intelligence with lots of organizations in the public sector. We've been sharing data with DHS for a number of years since the COVID-19 pandemic without any cost. We share information with SEAL, the Security Alliance for Web3 as well. Be in touch with me and happy to speak further. But there's also, I think, just looking into the DNS. ICANN also releases a lot of data, and their zone files are available through CZDS, and that's a great data source there.
Okay, thank you. You also have a question here from Coyote Oyeyemi asking, can a domain be explored by bad actors for the subdomain threat without hacking into them?
Oh, yeah. And let me be clear. If the question is whether I've hacked into any of these domains, I have not. If the question is about the threat actor accessing the domain to determine whether or not it's accessible, I think generally the answer is yes. And they're going to be exploring whether or not they can compromise a registrar account at that point, right? So or some kind of account that relates to the configuration of a domain at the host level, right? So a lot of times the registrar is also the host. So let's say you register the name with Namecheap, right? They're going to be looking for accounts that are vulnerable within Namecheap, right? So establishing MFA or multi-factor authentication on your registrar accounts, making sure those are locked down, making sure the principle of least privilege applies to anybody who would have access to those accounts are really important, especially for domains that have a lot of longevity, because as I indicated throughout the presentation, those are really high value to the threat actors looking for enhancing the level of trust of their phishing emails.
Okay, thank you. Let me ask you a question, and that is, do you see any trends in the abuse? Is there anything that's cooler to do now? Can you see anything like that?
Oh, yeah. We see a lot of trends, and I track a lot of stuff for years too. So an interesting trend is I'm tracking domains that begin with strings that are matches of top-level domains, right? So things that begin with com, things that begin with net, things that begin with org, and especially com-, net-, org-, and gov-. And a great pattern that we saw really tick up over the last year and a half or so was the registration of gov- domains. And what we're seeing now, and we've reported this over to FBI, and I think they're on the case. I hope. It's tricky for them. But we've been seeing a massive uptick in TLDs that are running certain cheaper registration types of sales on domains for gov- domains. And then those gov- domains are used to impersonate state governments. And then those state government impersonations in the subdomain space. So let's say I have a phone number that has the 802 area code in the United States. 802 is the Vermont area code. It's where I went to law school. I still have the same number from that many years ago, 20-something years ago. And when people are targeting my phone number, they're using the subdomain vermont.gov to impersonate the Vermont Department of Motor Vehicles and tell me that I have got some kind of unpaid toll and my license is going to be suspended through a smishing attack, right? So I'm getting a smish, an SMS phish sent to my phone with a subdomain that matches the area code of my phone number, making it look believable because it could be something like Vermont, the URL will be vermont.gov-session-toll-pay.cfp or something like that, or whatever it is, whatever the TLD is. I don't want to cast aspersions on any of our registry operators for running sales, but we're seeing massive amounts of that. And I think at the registrar level and at the registry level, frankly, if I can see it, then you can see it too. And I think we should all be doing our part to report this and make sure it doesn't proliferate.
So they're doing a good research as well.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, I don't see any more questions, but I see a lot of thank yous in the chat room.
Great.
So people think this was very informative. And yeah, you keep on getting thank you. So from me as well, thank you so much, Alexander, for being with us, for taking your time. For everyone on this webinar, I also wanted to say there will be another technical webinar taking place the 20th of May. I'll have colleagues from IANA with me who will give you an update on the KSK rollover and how you can prepare your resolver for that. So please be with us then. Again, Alexander, thank you so much. And thanks everyone for joining.
If I could just say in closing, thank you everybody for your wonderful questions. It was such a pleasure and honor. And thank you, Gabriella and Ulrich, for inviting me. It's a real honor to present to the ICANN community here. I'm here in Manchester at CPS until tomorrow. If anybody wants to meet up, I'm here, and I'll be over in London for INTA for the first couple of days next week as well. If you're over there, drop me a line. Such a pleasure, and thank you all.